Reporters is Reginald Bellin. He's Haitian American and works as a public affairs specialist. Bellin says he remembers how Donald Trump acted when his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol.
January 6th, I was a staffer. I was in the building. I was with my boss, Congressman Gregory Meeks at the time. We were locked in there from, when the riot started until 9 p.m. at night. I'll never forget that day. Before that day, I thought I worked in the safest place in the world. And after that day, I had to walk around looking over my shoulder as an African-American man. Trump was the one who sent his supporters there.
Vice President Harris concluded her campaigning yesterday with a rally in Philadelphia. Voters in 10 states are deciding questions about abortion access. Some measures seek to enshrine reproductive rights in state constitutions. Even in states such as Colorado and New York, abortion there is already protected legally. This is NPR.
And this is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. Polls are now open across Northeast Florida as Election Day is well underway, and voters here in the state have some big decisions to make. Chris Young tells us more about the amendments that are on the ballot.
Amendment 1 would make school board elections partisan. If passed, members can share their party affiliation when running for a seat. Amendment 2 would protect the right to hunt and fish in the Florida Constitution. The most controversial amendments, however, are 3 and 4. 3 would allow recreational marijuana use for those 21 and older. 4 would expand abortion rights and override Florida's ban after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Amendment 5 adds an inflation adjustment to the current homestead tax exemption. And Amendment 6 repeals a program allowing some Florida candidates to use public money to fund their campaigns. I'm Chris Young.
Each amendment will need 60% approval to pass. Polls are going to be open in the state until 7 tonight. And tune in to WJCT News 89.9 when polls close at 7 for live coverage and analysis of a local, state, and national election results. The ramp from Park Street to I-95 South is currently closed for median work by the city of Jacksonville, and it's expected to reopen next Tuesday on November 12th. In the meantime, a detour is going to take you from Park Street to Forest Street to Riverside Avenue, then onto I-95 South. For Election Day, we'll have mostly sunny skies with highs in the mid-80s. No rain in the forecast during the day. A slight chance for rain overnight, lows in the mid-70s.
In Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Insperity, providing HR services and technology, from payroll, benefits, and HR compliance to talent development. Learn more at Insperity.com/HR Matters. And the Doris Duke Foundation.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler, and it's Election Day. Just 10 hours before the polls close on the east coast of Florida, we examine key contests, including the fate of local tax proposals, marijuana and abortion amendments, and a surprisingly close Senate race. Later in the program, she's been called the Queen of the Forest Canopy, but her approach to teaching others about the essential role of forest ecosystems is actually very down to earth. We talked to National Geographic Explorer at Large, Nalini Nadkarni, ahead of her appearance Friday at the Jacksonville Zoo. But first, it is Election Day, and many Americans are experiencing anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Here to get us ready for the day and days ahead, we're joined by former political reporter and longtime election analyst and consultant John Daigle. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your willingness to be here today and tonight for our live election coverage. But this has been one of the most news-filled, exciting, sometimes bizarre election seasons in American history.
It has. I mean, I've been covering politics and focused on politics for a long time. I don't ever remember a cycle like this. We all lived through the 2000 hanging Chad election and the 2020 post 2020 election period. But I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, especially in an election season where everything we read about and everything we study shows that it could come down to an incredibly small number of voters.
Yeah. And so, Florida's got 2 time zones, obviously, so we're gonna have polls closing here at 7, on the West Coast then at 7, and so we may not see the first real chunk of statewide stuff until 8 o'clock. But what is it that you are going to be paying attention to first and foremost in the state of Florida?
Yeah, and as you pointed out, Florida is unique in that we have the 2 time zones. Florida is one of the states that allows election officials to begin sorting and prepping ballots to be counted before Election Day. So usually we get results from absentee votes and mail in votes pretty quickly, but state law says that they can't, that the whole state has to release them as one. And because our panhandle West Florida voters, their polls don't close till 8 o'clock Eastern time, we won't see the first results from mail-in ballots and early voting until after sometime probably between 8 and 8:30.
What about local results, though?
No, I don't think. Again, the first results that will come in are those mail-in ballots and the early voting, and I think all those will be posted at one time. So I don't think you'll see results on local elections. And again, the first results we'll see are those that big drop of the early voting and mail-in voting.
All right. And so we've been talking about Florida as a case of probably not always a purple state anymore. I mean, we're expecting that this is probably more of a red state just given the demographics of the GOP and voter registration.
Yeah, I mean, Florida used to be a fairly purple state. Over the last 10 years, the Republicans have really done a great job of voter registrations, and they've really worked hard on the ground game. They've built up about a 10-point advantage over the Democrats in terms of just pure voter registration. And early voting in Florida kind of reflects that. What we ended up in statewide with the Republicans with a little bit over a 10-point advantage in the early voting and the mail-in voting. So that GOP advantage that they have should show up in that first drop. I expect, that we've heard the terms the red mirage and the blue shift for a long time, and we'll likely see that in Florida because that 10-point advantage that the GOP has in Florida will show up in the early and absentee votes where that 10-vote advantage, and that's generally referred to as the red mirage, where those first votes drop, and it looks to Republicans like they're doing very well. And then as the night progresses and we get some more of the election day voters, you have what's described as the blue shift, where Democrats begin overcoming those early numbers that the GOP typically has in Florida.
And I think supervisors of election have tried of late to make clear that that's not an indication that there's something wrong or that that's something fraudulent, but that really is just part of the process and skews to how people vote and who votes which way.
Yeah, and that has become a big problem. And again, especially in a race where one candidate is likely to declare victory prematurely, it's a problem, when that happens and Republicans get, who aren't very familiar with the process, get very optimistic when they see those early numbers and they think they've won the race. And then the classic blue shift starts happening, and a lot of people get very suspicious that something funny is going on because, wait, we were just ahead by 10 points, and now it's even. It is something that happens. Now, 2020 was an outlier because of COVID and the very odd patterns that we had with mail-in votes that year. But I think this year we're probably getting back to a more traditional patterns in what we see in terms of which party wins the early votes and which party wins Election Day.
We've talked about the party split when it comes to the type of voting, but you've actually dug into a gender gap that's emerged in early voting. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing on how men and women are voting differently through that means.
Yeah, and I have been looking at mainly the 7 swing states because I think there's some things that could happen. I mean, there's some strange polling going on. We saw polling over the weekend where a state like Iowa could be in play, but I'm still focused mainly on what numbers I'm seeing on early voting.
And remind us what the swing states are.
So, basically, you've got 6 or 7, depending on how you look at it. I really think it's 7 states. You've got the 3 so-called blue wall states up in north, and that's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which almost no Democrat president has ever gotten into the White House without winning those three blue wall states. I think I saw a number that goes back to like 1956 since a Democratic candidate, won the White House without those three blue wall states. And then you've got the Sun Belt swing states, which again is usually Georgia, Nevada, and in Arizona. But this year, I think a lot of people have thrown North Carolina into those Sun Belt swing states. So you've got North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona.
Yeah. And so you've been primarily looking at the gender gap as it impacts
Yeah.
early voting in those states. And what is it that you're finding?
Well, in almost all of those swing states, the women voters are in early voting have far outpaced men voters. I think I've seen anything from a 5-point to a 10-point advantage, depending on the state. Um, that, again, some analysis says that that's a very good sign for Harris. The gender gap, especially with abortion being on the ballot in 10 states and on the heels of Roe v. Wade, there's a lot of speculation that gender gap that we're seeing in early voting and mail-in voting and likely on election day is good news for the Harris campaign.
Yeah. So there has been record voter turnout in some places. And I know just anecdotally, I waited in line for early voting for the first time ever since I've lived in Florida. And I've heard the same from a lot of people I know that they were waiting in lines for early voting. It does seem like there's a lot more people, but perhaps that is also just people shifting the way they vote.
It is. I mean, we have seen it. Mail-in ballots are coming back. We did see a significant drop off in mail-in ballots, especially in the last two cycles, when, particularly on the Republican side, there's been doubts cast about the security of mail-in ballots and so forth. So some of the numbers have shifted. Typically, we can expect to see about half the voters vote before Election Day. And in some states that have been, especially the swing states that have received a lot of the political advertising spending money, we have seen record numbers in the early voting. But it's hard to say whether we're still whether those early voters have cannibalized election day voters, or whether we're going to see an overall record turnouts in those states, or whether we're just seeing more votes coming in early. The Republicans have kind of come back to embrace. I mean, mail-in ballots used to be the primary territory for Republican voters. And then during the Trump years, I think there was some doubt cast on mail-in ballots, but it seems to be coming back now with GOP voters relying more heavily on mail-in ballots. We'll know today whether we're seeing just record early voting or whether record voting overall.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we were talking to political analyst John Daigle about Election Day, or perhaps election week, as some are predicting. You can join our conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also tag us on social media. You made a little nod there to spending. And John, as a longtime political consultant, from spending.
Yeah.
This has been a very big spending year on a couple of initiatives in Florida, particularly Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. That's the recreational marijuana and abortion.
Yeah, I mean, and good news for Florida broadcast companies, because on the terms of the presidential race, we've seen almost nothing spent in Florida. We're not really considered a swing state, and really the only races that have seen significant spending in Florida is the Senate race between Scott and Marcuso Powell, and then Amendments 3 and 4, and in those areas, we've seen record numbers that we've never seen spending in election cycle like we have this cycle on Amendments 3 and 4. And nationally, in terms of ballot initiatives, Florida has been second only to California in terms of spending on ballot initiatives. The recreational marijuana amendment has received significantly more than the abortion amendment, but combined, it's I think the figure is something like 250 or a little bit over $250 million combined on those, and which is just blows us out of the water, even compared to some of the big amendments we've seen in the past, like medical marijuana and felon voting, and some of the other very high-profile amendments.
You're saying 250 million kind of on Amendment 4 and Amendment 3 jointly?
Yes,
Yeah, and we know
combined.
that a lot of the money has been coming for the amendment on marijuana from True Leave, which is a dispensary. They've, bankrolled a lot of the spending on Amendment 3,
Yeah.
but there's also been some state spending. Remind us what's happening there.
So, and let me correct myself because I looked at my notes. It's actually about 225 million total on those. And you're right. The vast majority of the spending in favor of recreational marijuana, Amendment 3, has come from True Leave, which obviously has an economic interest in its passage. They're the primary provider of medical marijuana in Florida, and would have a huge business expansion if recreational marijuana was legalized. On the opposing side of that amendment, you've seen a sort of a collection of money. You've got PAC money in there, um, and which is normally where money comes from on the ballot initiatives. But you've also got a couple other sources of funding that have fought against that amendment that have raised some eyebrows. There's been an estimated $50 million in taxpayer money invested in defeating that amendment, and that's come from the Florida Department of Transportation and other Florida state agencies that have come under fire for spending taxpayer money trying to fight that amendment. Some of it has been pretty overt with outright vote no on Amendment 3, and then some have been more subtle with all of a sudden we're seeing commercials pop up with local sheriffs including our own, talking about marijuana being bad. Doesn't mention the amendment, but there's been a lot of spending on some of the dangers of marijuana, which, again, the coincidence there is hard to ignore. But between the Republican Party of Florida putting in about $3.5 million, the PAC spending, and the state money, the anti-Amendment 3 forces have not quite matched the pro-amendment forces, but they've come pretty far in terms of matching the spending on that amendment.
A large part of that with the state money.
Yeah, I think the largest of the three pots was state money.
Yeah.
And of course, Governors DeSantis and First Lady Casey DeSantis have invested heavily in their own personal political capital in fighting that amendment.
Same with Amendment 4, the abortion amendment. That also has had a big chunk of state money that you estimate has paid for, tens of thousands of television and radio ads.
Yeah, and Department of Health and others have invested in, and they've come under fire. There's been some legal challenges to that spending, but they have spent tens of millions of dollars in fighting that, which again is pretty unusual. I don't know that I've ever seen any election cycle where tax money was used in that way. I'm sure post-election there's going to be a lot of discussion about whether or not that's appropriate. And again, I think depending on which way the vote goes on those amendments, if they both succeed as they're expected to, it will have a considerable toll. Take a considerable toll on Governor DeSantis' political capital.
Why is that? Explain to us how, he's obviously kind of term limited after this term. So how does it impact his clout?
Well, I mean, as I said, he's gone all in on that, and as has Casey DeSantis, and it's become a pretty interesting test of whether or not once he had his political power in Florida was pretty strong. I mean, he was the most coveted endorsement in Florida for many years. You've seen some the break off among the Republican Party. You have some key Republican leaders in Florida, including former President Trump, who have become on the opposite side of DeSantis on this issue. You've had a lot of
marijuana
on the marijuana issue. Yeah, you've had a lot of local Republican sheriffs come out and do advertising saying it's time to pass this recreational marijuana amendment. So it's an issue where you see some defections within the Florida GOP. You see some split in that party over it, and with how heavily and personally DeSantis has invested himself in this, if it were to fail, I think a lot of people would say that's the beginning of his time as a lame duck governor.
So we know that Florida's threshold for passing a ballot amendment is higher than most places. It's a 60% threshold. Do you care to forecast? Do you have any feeling about how these two amendments that are getting so much attention might pan out?
I mean, history says that they're both going to pass. I mean, if you look at Florida's history, most amendments that get to the point where they're on the ballot, and it's not easy to get these amendments on the ballot. But once you get on the ballot and you get past all the legal challenges, and especially if you raise more money than your opposition, almost always those amendments pass. So history tell both the advocates for Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 have both raised and spent significant money, more than their opposition. And history tells us that both those, even with that high threshold of 60%, which is, as you point out, is not the same in other states, both of them I expect to reach that threshold.
I'm curious what you think about Amendment 1 in that respect. That's the one that would return school board races to partisan races.
Yeah.
Has not gotten as much attention, certainly has not gotten anywhere near the money. But do you think that that also will reach the threshold, just given how kind of low on the totem pole it's been in terms of attention?
That one's trickier because, as you said, it's not gotten a lot of attention. Political insiders know a lot about it. If you're one of the few people who really follows politics closely, and the whole issue is whether or not you want partisan politics involved in our local school board races. And of course, anybody who's paid any attention recently knows that whether we like it or not, partisan politics has become very much a part of our local school board races. But in that race, part of me says, obviously, with the GOP advantage, the GOP likes that amendment. They would like to see school board races partisan. And you could say that because of their voter registration advantage and their turnout, so far their turnout advantage, that would pass. However, the wild card there is independents. In Florida, you've got somewhere between 20 and 30% of voters are independents. And certainly that block of voters is not really keen on turning our local school board races into partisan
Interesting
thing. So I really think that I'm not as confident on Amendment 1 because I think that that large chunk, as much as almost a third of voters who are independents or NPAs, are probably going to vote against that. And there's been very little money spent on it, and not many people know much about it. So if I had to place a bet, I don't think I'd be betting on passage of Amendment 1.
I want to ask you a little bit about some of the national Senate and House races, because in addition to the presidency being decided, those are going to be very consequential. They're very, very close chambers. And, Florida is considered a contested Senate race between Senator Rick Scott, the incumbent, and Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, the challenger. I don't know that that's considered as competitive as some of the other places. So which states are you primarily going to be watching with a sense of whether, where control could go in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's 34 of the Senate's 100 seats are up for election right now. Most of those we know which way they're going to go. There are a few states where there are crucial Senate races that will decide the balance of who controls the Senate, no matter who the president is. Traditionally, people have been talking about the races in Ohio, Nebraska, Maryland, but more and more lately, some people are throwing Florida into that mix. And I'll explain a little bit why Florida normally wouldn't be in the mix of Senate races being watched like this, with incumbent Rick Scott running, being well financed and having great name ID. Two things make me think that the Senate race in Florida could be a lot closer than some people think. One is Rick Scott's history of winning elections. He's never won any elections by huge margins. He's run against some pretty high-profile Democrats, Alex Sink and Nelson and Christ. But I mean, the most he's ever won in his last three elections is by 1.5 or something like that. His last election against Nelson, he won by just 10,000 votes.
It was a real squeaker.
He's not winning elections by 20% like DeSantis did in 2022. The other thing is you've got a lot of young new voters coming out in Florida for the Amendment 3 and 4, and a lot of female voters and a lot of young voters and a lot of first-time voters who are interested in those issues. I don't think Scott will be the favored candidate among those voters who are primarily interested in 3 and 4. That, I think, makes the Scott Mucarsel-Powell race a lot more interesting. She's dropped late in the race. The National Democratic Party put some money into Mucarsel-Powell's race, and she's been running ads. I've seen them even here in Jacksonville, which is kind of interesting. But that race could be close. And again, as it stands now, most experts predict that the Republicans will retake control of the Senate. But there are a few races, even the Texas race with Allred and Cruz. Some people are saying that that could be a surprising race. And if Texas and Florida, if we were to see surprises in those races, the Democrats could easily keep control of the Senate.
Let's just briefly talk about the House because all 435 seats are up for grabs. Republicans are currently, the majority. What's your expectation, and what are you going to be? What particular states that you're watching?
Yeah, that's a little more tricky. I just have 435 different races in a lot of different states, and again, it's hard to have any solid predictions. But I think if any factor really influences the sort of the direction of all those hundreds of races, I have to believe that the Roe v. Wade amendment is going to have a backlash. Typically in politics, you see when one party does an overreach, and it typically creates a backlash a year or two later. And I think we are going to see a backlash from the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and I think it's going to show up in a lot of those local House races. You've got abortion on the ballot in 10 states. And unlike Florida, in most of those states, you don't need a 60% supermajority. You only need a 50%. So there's 10 states where female voters are going to come out very strong and try to send a message about the reversal of Roe v. Wade.
Well, John Daigle, thank you so much for being here this morning. We'll see you in just a few short hours for our live election coverage, which starts at 7 tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, the scientist who inspired Treetop Barbie brings the light and the magic of the forest canopy. Welcome back. She's been called the Queen of the Forest Canopy and Treetop Barbie, but her mission is pragmatic and very down to earth. Joining us ahead of her appearance Friday at the Jacksonville Zoo is Nalini Nadkarni. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So the Treetop Barbie moniker is kind of a joke, but you actually helped create a Barbie doll. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. That's right. I'm a forest ecologist and a scientist, and I spend a lot of my time communicating with other scientists, but I also know that there are a lot of disturbances and interferences going on with forest ecosystems. And I felt that, as a scientist and as a person, it's really important for me to not only do scientific communication, but also to make more people, all kinds of people, aware of the importance of trees and forests to people and to the earth. And I began thinking about how I could sort of awaken the interest of little girls, especially little girls who are growing up and living in urban areas and cities where they might not be able to climb trees the way I did when I was a little girl and first sort of fell in love with trees and wanted to protect them and help them. So I began thinking about ways that I could connect what girls already really love to trees and forests. And I, of course, came up with Barbie because pretty much every little girl and many little boys love Barbie and really look to Barbie as a role model. So I approached Mattel back in 2004 with the idea of creating a Treetop Barbie. They were actually not interested in that. It didn't quite fit their brand. And so my students and I began making our own Treetop Barbies by buying used Barbies at consignment stores, getting volunteer seamstresses to create little outfits, field outfits, buying helmets on eBay, and then creating a little pamphlet about canopy plants to go along with her. Well, fast forward, that was really small scale, very, 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 very small scale. But fast forward to 2021, and it turned out that National Geographic and Mattel decided to create a line of Explorer Barbies based on this idea of inspiring young girls to be attracted to and connect with exploration-type careers. They made a polar astrophysicist Barbie and a nature photographer Barbie and an entomologist Barbie, and they asked me to be an advisor on that project because it was sort of my idea to do that, and I was, of course, totally happy to do that. And as a thank you and recognition, they made me a one-of-a-kind Nalini lookalike Treetop Barbie, which I have in my lab and I'm really proud of.
Oh.
And I think it's not so much a story of my idea or Mattel or National Geographic, but really it means I think that there are more and more little girls who really do aspire to having a role model that is active and contributing to the environment like Treetop Barbie.
So what inspired your own interest in ecology and canopy ecology in particular?
That's a great question. As with so many scientists, I think that that initial attraction for me came as a little kid. My parents had a suburban home in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., and we were lucky enough to have these 8 maple trees that lined the driveway of our home. And after school, for whatever reason, I would find it sort of great joy in going out and choosing one of those maple trees to climb and basically just spend time in this, they weren't giant maples, they weren't amazing maples, but they were my maples. And none of my brothers and sisters climbed trees, and certainly my parents didn't. And so for me, it became kind of my place, my refuge, the place that I could think and reflect and watch squirrels and just kind of be myself up there. And so I remember as an 8-year-old taking a really solemn oath, as little kids do, of saying, well, when I'm a grown-up, I'm going to do something to protect trees. And as it turned out, I sort of discovered the field of ecology, the science of understanding the relationship between the environment and plants and animals when I started college. And I realized that's really one pathway that one can take, that I could take, to both understand trees, but also to better protect them.
But when you started in this field, the field itself of canopy ecology was really in its nascent stages. You kind of helped bring that along.
That's right. And I really feel privileged and lucky that I was able to see, sort of a sub-discipline of science start from almost nothing. Really was considered sort of Tarzan and Jane stuff of climbing trees with mountain climbing techniques, but to really understand that there is a world of the forest that we have not yet discovered. In fact, back in the 1980s, it was called the last biotic frontier. And so that just signaled that, there really were things to discover there that might be important, not only about the forest canopy itself, but about, as an ecosystem ecologist, how does what's going on in the canopy affect the rest of the forest ecosystem as a whole? And so for the last 42 years, I've been really trying to understand that and trying to communicate with other scientists, with other people, with forest managers, with all kinds of people about what is going on in this last biotic frontier that is a concern to us here, both on the forest floor and within the canopy. And it's been quite a journey as I've been able to observe more and more scientists getting involved with that, people now doing science using remote sensing, using drones, using modern scientific tools to really understand this fundamental and this critical part of the forest ecosystem.
So what is the importance of canopy plants to the ecosystem of a forest? And tell us a little bit, what is it like being up in a rainforest canopy?
Yeah, well, I wish I could take you up there because it is so fascinating. Well, first of all, at the most basic, the forest canopy has a very different, what we call microenvironment than the forest floor. The forest floor is very damp, very dark, no wind because of the overlying branches and leaves. But when you go into the canopy and climb up there, whether it's with mountain climbing ropes or a construction crane or a hot air balloon, however you get up there, what you experience is an environment that has much more sunlight, much greater extremes of relative humidity. There's a lot more wind up there. And so that microenvironment, that different environment, has given rise to the evolution of a tremendous diversity of plants and animals that live all or part of their lives up in the treetops. And so my fundamental question was well, what are these plants and animals doing up here? And how do they get there? How do they maintain themselves? How do they reproduce? What happens when they die? But most of all, what's most interesting to me is how are they affecting other parts of the ecosystem? And what I learned with my students and my colleagues is that these canopy-dwelling plants are capable, because they don't have roots that go into the tree nor to the forest floor, they rely on water and nutrients that come in the form of mist and cloud and rain that bathe the rainforest canopy. And this rain and precipitation actually they contain small dilute amounts of nutrients that are dissolved in those raindrops. So these canopy plants are able to intercept and retain nutrients that are coming in from outside the ecosystem. They stay there in those canopy-dwelling plant bodies for some amount of time, and then ultimately they fall to the forest floor where they decompose, and they're available to the terrestrially rooted vegetation like trees and shrubs and herbs on the forest floor. So they're actually really important in maintaining healthy nutrient cycles of the forest as a whole. And in addition to that, their fruits and the flowers and the materials that they produce are available to birds and arboreal mammals for nectar, for energy, for nutrients, and for nesting material. So although they constitute sort of a small amount of the biomass of the forest as a whole, they have a disproportionately important set of roles that they play in terms of both nutrient cycling as well as providing wildlife, habitat, and other resources.
Nalini, you're a biology professor at the University of Utah, but you're also known for your creative messaging and your presentations that are innovative in a way that's sort of not unlike the Barbie that you helped create. You work in all kinds of medium. You work with artists, with dancers, with slam poets. Explain how you try to communicate environmental messaging through art and
Sure.
creativity.
You bet. That's one of the great joys of my life has been sort of the capacity to say, like, well, scientists communicate with these what look like really boring articles with no illustrations in scientific journals, and we give talks that are very dry and academic to other scientists, which are of great interest and importance to other scientists, but they don't really always connect with people who aren't in the scientific and academic world. And it seems to me early on that artists have ways of communicating to audiences that are interested in sculpture or music or slam poetry or spoken word poetry or visual art that are equally as powerful in communicating ideas and concepts as scientific articles are. Of course, the content is different, but the idea of transmuting messages through the medium of art was very appealing to me because it seems like, well, maybe some artists wouldn't choose to go to an academic scientific seminar, but they would go to an art gallery or to a poetry reading or to a sculpture garden. And so I got some funds from the National Geographic Society to explore this, and I carried out a series of what I call canopy confluences, where I bring together a set of both forest ecologists, but also visual artists, hip-hop poets, singers, creative writers, poets, and we spend a week in the forest together. We put canopy platforms into the canopy of this forest, and we spend a week out there camping, climbing into these platforms. The artists spend a whole day at a time sitting up on those platforms and perceiving the forest canopy and sort of translating and communicating what they perceive in their art or in their poetry or in their hip-hop music. We spend the evenings together around the campfire and share what we saw, what we perceived, what we came to understand through whatever medium that the participants choose to do. And the result of that has been a series of art gallery showings, of modern dance performances, of poetry slams that don't just translate what I understand with my scientific mind to those audiences, but rather what the perceptions and the communication is of the artists themselves. Because artists aren't just translators, they are themselves perceivers and understanders of their environment. And it's been really wonderful to see the responses that come from dance audiences, from art gallery visitors, from slam poetry participants, to see how the wonder of what trees are can be to those who use these other media and people who receive those media.
You've also worked with the carceral community. I mean, people who are in prison, and done presentations before those audiences. Why? I mean, what's the connection there?
Yeah, that it seems like what the hell is a forest ecologist doing in a state prison? And it seems like a very distant kind of non-connection. But when I was thinking, and working with artists, and I know that artists often obviously have access to forests. They can walk around the forest whenever they want. But when I was thinking of what is the group of people in our country who don't have access, really literally do not have physical access to nature or to forests or to trees, I realized that the people farthest away from the forest are people who are incarcerated, who because of their physical and their legal situations can't go for a walk in the forest, cannot get the benefit of connecting or engaging with trees and forests and other parts of nature. And so back in 2004, I began a program called the Sustainability in Prisons Program, where we brought scientists to state prisons. I started it out myself by giving talks about trees. We started a moss growing project to try to help alleviate the negative effects of collecting mosses from wild primary forests for the horticulture trade, and inmates I engaged inmates to learn how to grow mosses to take some of that pressure off these primary forests. And that led to a whole scientific lecture series in a number of state prisons in Washington state. It led to collaborations with conservation groups like the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Nature Conservancy to train people who are currently incarcerated in rearing endangered species like the Oregon spotted frog, endangered prairie plant, the Taylor checker spot butterfly, so that these men and women were actively engaged behind bars in contributing to ecological restoration projects and conservation, and realizing that they themselves, although they're incarcerated, although they have been disempowered to become or be productive members of society, so to speak, can contribute to helping the earth. And it's been an enormously wonderful and successful project. It now exists in all of the state prisons in Washington state, as well as in other prisons around the country, to demonstrate that if given the opportunity, everybody has a possibility, everybody has the potential to contribute to trying to mitigate some of the negative effects that human activities have had on biodiversity and ecosystem function of our ecosystem.
So, in addition to all of the work that you do as a scientist and an educator, you're also a National Geographic Explorer. Explain to us, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I feel really privileged to have been named what's called a National Geographic Explorer at Large. When you get National Geographic, in addition to the many media things it does, also provides grants for scientists, for photographers, for storytellers. And if you get one of those grants, you're called an explorer. There have been about 20,000 over the history of National Geographic. There are about 1,500 active explorers now. But National Geographic has also has a designation that they've granted to 10 of their explorers. And I was last year designated as one of these explorers at large. So other ones are Sylvia Earle, the amazing marine biologist, Maya Lin, the architect, Bob Baller, the undersea explorer. And so my role as an explorer at large is really to carry out the work that I do in research in the forest canopy, but also to try to expand engagement of all of our explorers so that they go not only to museums or give lectures in big lecture halls about what their explorations are about, but also to go to underserved groups like people who are in prison, like older citizens, people in senior assisted living centers or kids in daycare centers, to try to spread the knowledge that we've been able to gain that has been supported by the National Geographic to as many community-based venues as we can. And so it gives me, being an explorer at large allows me to get access to the amazing resources that National Geographic has in terms of its media, its photographs, the knowledge base of all of its explorers, but to try to share that with as many people and as broadly as possible with the American population.
And so you're going to be here in town at the Jacksonville Zoo. It's a part of a fundraiser event that they have called the Toast to Conservation on November 8th. What can people expect from you there?
Well, I'm really looking forward to being at the Jacksonville Zoo. I know that it's really just this incredible beacon of conservation and education, as well as providing information to people in Jacksonville and all of the visitors that go there. I'll be giving a talk, about a 40-minute talk about my own work in the forest canopy, letting people in the audience there know about the research and the conservation work that I and other tropical ecologists do in the forest canopy, but also talking about ways that institutions and organizations that, like zoos and natural history museums and botanic gardens, can play in informing and making the general population aware of the importance of maintaining biodiversity, of carrying out active research in conservation the way institutions like the Jacksonville Zoo does. So I'm looking forward to seeing the zoo, to learning about its active programs in conservation in Florida and around the world, and then linking that to some of the efforts that are going on, some of them supported by National Geographic, that go on around the world.
And just briefly, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing forest ecosystems today?
Well, there are so many challenges right now. I mean, with wildfires, with climate change, with deforestation and forest fragmentation. I think that what we really need is to raise awareness. I think one of the things that really plagues trees and forests is is that they're silent and they seem to be sedentary. They can't really speak for themselves. And so I think although really everybody loves trees, I've never met anybody who doesn't love trees, I think we often overlook the services that they provide and the wonder they provide and the absolutely critical ecosystem offerings that they provide in terms of providing oxygen and stabilizing soil. And so I think that when people become aware of the importance of something in their lives, whether it's the little patch of forest in their city pocket parks or whether it's some other aspect of their lives, they will figure out how to protect it. They will elect the right officials. They will contribute to the groups that support their conservation. But I think the biggest challenge is really that people, because of the nature of trees and forests being silent and not being able to advocate themselves, I think the biggest thing that I feel like I want to do is to raise awareness of how essential, how critical, and how important trees are in our lives.
Well, it's the Toast to Conservation, November 8th. It's from 6 to 10 p.m., and Nalini Nadkarni will be there. Thank you, Nalini, so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to being in Jacksonville. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we crack the next chapter of the Florida Theater's storytelling series.
Vickers Landing offers elegant retirement living in the heart of Ponte Vedra Beach. Our Sawgrass and Oak Ridge campuses feature amenities galore, resort lifestyle, comprehensive security, and plans for every stage of aging. Retirement redefined. VickersLanding.com.
The Museum of Science and History presents Mission Astronaut, a new exhibition exploring life in space. Mission Astronaut is open September 21st through January 5th. More info at mosh.org.
New migrants have been moving to Whitewater, Wisconsin.
That has been a massive shift, just in the types of things that our officers are dealing with day to day.
The private economy is shifting to absorb and accommodate, and in the public sector, we're doing the same thing.
The city is actually welcoming of the migrants. What they want is financial help. Why aren't they getting it? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, we remember Quincy Jones and listen back to my 2001 interview with him. He died Sunday. He was an arranger, composer, and producer for music that spans from the big bands through bebop, pop, movie soundtracks, TV themes, and hip-hop. He produced Michael Jackson's albums Off the Wall, Bad, and Thriller. Join us
today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
As the uses for artificial intelligence seemingly grow overnight, it can be hard to stay in the know. How could OpenAI's new ChatGPT search engine revolutionize how we look things up online? Why is Google adding generative AI to its map service? And what exactly is an AI agent? Next time on 1A, we answer these questions and more as we explore the latest advancements in AI technology and what they might mean for you.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. A popular storytelling series returns to the stage this Thursday at the Florida Theater. Joining me to talk about the series' fourth season is and its creative theme is artistic director and host Barbara Colacello. Good morning, Barbara.
Hi, Ann.
Nice to have you. Also, one of the featured storytellers, Linda Altman. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning.
Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. Barbara, the theme of this season's performances is wave. the goal obviously is to be broad in these topic areas, but how do you choose the actual prompts?
Yeah, this year it's wave, cloud, trail, route. So I just meditated on Jacksonville, and I wanted to come up with words that were nouns, but also verbs.
Uh-huh. You're like driving me crazy on Wordle and Match, right? It's like, yeah.
And so when I say to somebody, cloud, something that, is cloudy, but also, and so with wave, there's just so many things that you could think about.
Yeah.
But what we're finding out with all the stories, because wave is that ebb and flow, and we think of the waves of life, right? So the stories do have the highs and the lows, and I think it's also about moving through. A lot of the stories are moving through
Mm.
and learning how to surf.
What, without giving too much away, what are some of the various interpretations that you've seen of that word?
Wave, one of the stories, are very memorable, waving goodbye to something. Also, like receiving, bringing something, like bring it on. Um, birth wave. There's a story that has to do with birthing.
Mm.
And uh, Linda could probably talk about how she attacked it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, Linda, well, so you are one of the featured storytellers. Is this your first time doing an Untold Stories?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about your own story, the theme, how you incorporated it.
Wow.
Without giving it away.
Right.
Well, what is the wave in your story? How's that?
I think it's the waves of life, the ups and downs, having something affect you so deeply that you ride to the top and you're excited, and then the next moment you're down.
Mm-hmm.
So just those ups and downs of life.
You are a Jacksonville native, or you grew up in Jacksonville.
I grew up in Jacksonville, right.
And you do a lot of things in the arts. I mean, you do ceramics, you do photography, you're a creative writer. How does all of that fit into what you bring to your performance?
Wow. I think we all have stories within us that are just stored in there. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about this, as a creative writer, you're very descriptive, right? So one of the things that Babs has helped me do is to hone my story and to shape my story into something very succinct instead of it being this long creative story. And something that I could get on stage and tell within like 10 or 12 minutes.
How does she do that? Like how does she kind of guide you or shepherd you to the place you need to be? Is she brusque? Is she demanding, or is she just sort of gentle in her advice?
All of the above.
Okay.
Demanding. I guess there are points where I'll be like, no, it needs to be this.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's a rhythm thing. As we get closer to performance, it's getting people to take those words off the page.
Uh-huh.
And so you wouldn't say it like that. You wrote it like that, but you wouldn't have the comma and the da ba da ba da ba, It's just like boom.
Yeah.
And it's almost like I start saying, act like you're a stand-up comic.
Do you find that people's written stories change once they start
They have
speaking them
to.
through? Yeah.
They have to. If they don't, you could tell when they've completely memorized it and it sounds like a writer who's giving a talk.
Reading, yeah.
And I really, that's why we do a story workshop, like it's 4 hours long, to find their authentic voice and just to get them into storytelling mode
Yeah.
rather than story shaping. I use the word shaping because that's different than when you tell something. It's more like a report. If you shape your words, you stick to the paper. So it's shaping the sounds, and that makes a good dynamic speaker.
Do you select performers and assign the topic, or do you ask for submissions on a topic and then choose the storytellers that do it best?
Oh, I tell you what, casting, finding the right people for the right theme is very challenging. It's like, you get you have a storyteller with one theme, and like I'll know instinctively this person can perform. They're not going to have a problem with doing the performance. But the ADHD, I'm going to have a problem getting them to actually write the script. But they're really magical and they really have a good story. So it's some people. Everybody brings different strengths.
Yeah.
And we have to, I have to work with each person.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. But Linda Altman, it's a delight to meet you. Have a
Nice
great
to meet you.
performance.
Thank
Break a
you.
leg Thursday night at the Florida Theater.
Come, it's good.
And people may need a break from election
Yes,
stuff. Yeah.
yes,
All
yes.
right.
It's wonderful. Just
Barbara
to listen to one
Colacello.
another.
Barbara Colacello, thank you also for being here. And that's our program. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got questions, feedback, or suggestions, you can send it all to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Don't forget to join us tonight at 7 for live local election coverage. We'll see you back here at 9 tomorrow for analysis of the election results. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.